stories about Australia really, and how really I have come here to thank you all, because your resistance to GMOs over the last 10 years has meant that the Australian farmers who are growing, unfortunately, 2 GM crops at the moment, which is GMO rapeseed and also GM cotton, are actually getting more. The non-GM farmers are getting more for their crops, approximately £10 per tonne, because they're growing non-GM compared to the small number of farmers who are growing GM. There's about 15% farmers who have taken up GM in the last 6 years, and we're finding a reducing number of farmers. They're finding that it's not actually doing what it was advertised, and a lot of the older farmers stood back and thought, we'll see what happens. The younger farmers were tending to go for it a bit more, but now really in my state it's only 5%. So it's just a good news story that the consumer resistance to actually eating the stuff has helped the farmers in Australia to resist it. So good on all of you, and thanks very much. That's one of the stories. Now, the other good news is that we have 2 states in Australia which are GM-free zones, so no GM can be grown there. In fact, the Agriculture Minister in South Australia actually comes to the marches against Monsanto, which everyone's pretty amazed by. Another GMO-free state is Tasmania. So, unfortunately, because there is GM grown, there's the case of Steve Marsh. Some of you might have heard of him before. So he is an organic grower, growing spelt wheat on his farm and working really hard in very dry conditions. So unfortunately, his next door neighbour decided to grow GMO rapeseed. So of course, as we know, the nature spread seeds, and the winds blew the seeds onto his land, and so his organic certification was removed. So of course, that's an outrage to us. Monsanto don't go around suing people in Australia because they realise it'll give them too much bad publicity. But what has happened is he now can't market his organic crops in the way that he was able to up till the time that GM was grown next door to him. So his only legal recourse was to take his neighbour to court for damages. So he's done that. He lost the case. We were all distraught, of course, but he has now appealed. And in the appeal process, guess what name turned up as someone who supports the GM farmer with his financial demands? Monsanto. Of course, everyone suspected it, but it's now come out in the court case that Monsanto were there helping the GM farmer when this court case happened. Of course, it's a fight all the time now between GM and non-GM, but a new group of farmers has now grown up just out of the blue called non-GM farmers, and you can actually go to their website if you want to have a look. So they're really lively, and they are the voice of the majority in Western Australia. So good on them. So that's 2 of the stories. The other story is how I became an activist against GM, which is actually, again, thanks to all of you, because I was living here in the late 90s, early 2000 with my kids, and I knew that by coming here I might be exposing my kids to GM food. So, of course, I was very conscious and very careful to avoid GM in all cases. But that was the time when the GM crops were first threatened to be planted in the UK countryside, and that's when people went out and took direct action and pulled them up. And it made people like me, who were very worried about what my kids were going to eat, much comforted when the supermarkets started all competing with each other to remove GM from their own brand products. As we heard from Liz earlier today, now they're sneaking it back into their foods, and they say our own brand products might be GM free, but we're also selling other ones. As far as I'm concerned, if they accept money for a product which is GM, they take that responsibility, and we need to hold them to account. And I want to see what happened we have done in Melbourne, where I live, which is collecting up the products that could be GM, putting them up in supermarket trolleys and taping them up as a biohazard, and presenting that to the people at the customer services desk, because they have the companies, not the individuals who are actually working in the shops, but the companies have a responsibility if those GM products are on their shelves. We actually had a crisis with some donuts that were actually labelled as having GM in them, and of course immediately they either removed the labelling or else they removed the ingredient because of the fuss that we made. And one last story is just about activism as a GM-free mum. Of course, when our children are young, sometimes we can't breastfeed, therefore we're forced to use infant formula. Well, what we discovered is that the soy infant formula had GM in it, and it was actually tested a couple of times because they have a regulation in Australia that if it's an accidental contamination, it's not illegal. Well, it was tested and found that it had under 1%, but it had a GM ingredient in that soy formula. So we did an action where we went in to the supermarket aisles and actually occupied the aisles and labelled this product as containing GM. Of course, they didn't want to arrest us in the supermarket aisles, so they just put up with us there for the day. But the crucial message here is that we have to protect the vulnerable in our society, and they have no right to allow their genetic fingerprints in our children's food, and that goes for baby food, infant formula and so on. And as you might have heard, the mums across America have tested their breast milk and found that it contains a level of glyphosate. So that just shows you how far Monsanto's products have actually sort of reached inside our bodies. And just one last thing, I suppose you might have heard of Feed the World. They're a group which is now operating globally, and they're offering that you can test your own bodies for the level of glyphosate in your urine. So I know it sounds a bit personal, but again, we need to know actually the fact that glyphosate is spread on city streets to stop weeds. It might have even been spread here, and that's all part of the Monsanto picture, which is GM crops and massive amounts of glyphosate. So I suppose that's the warning. And I'm having a holiday because I usually end up organising the March Against Monsanto in Melbourne. So there are marches against Monsanto today in Brisbane, Perth and Noumea, and also some small country towns. So the word is definitely spreading, and I'm very happy to be here today having a holiday, but also seeing all of you and spreading the word.